The Silent Cabin, the unsolved Keddie murders that still terrify investigators. In the still pine-scented air of the Sierra Nevada mountains, nestled among the trees and quiet gravel roads of Keddie, California, stood Cabin 28, a simple, unremarkable structure with weathered siding and a sagging roof. By all appearances, it was nothing more than a modest rental cabin in a struggling rural town. But on the morning of April 12, 1981, that cabin would become the scene of one of the most brutal and perplexing unsolved crimes in American history. When the sun rose over Keddie that spring morning, it cast its light on something the town would never forget. 3 people slaughtered in cold blood, with a fourth, 12-year-old Tina Sharp, nowhere to be found. This wasn't just murder. It was overkill. And it wasn't just mysterious. It was sinister. The story begins with a family that had already endured hardship. Glenna Susan Sharp, known simply as Sue, had moved to Keddie just months earlier, escaping an abusive marriage. She brought with her 5 children, John, Sheila, Tina, Rick, and Greg, seeking a fresh start in the quiet isolation of California's Plumas County. The Sharps lived in Cabin 28, a rundown unit within a former resort that had been converted into low-income housing. Sue was doing her best. She was on welfare, taking typing classes, and doing everything she could to raise her children with dignity in a town where jobs were scarce and neighbors kept to themselves. But nothing could prepare her, or anyone else, for what was coming. On the night of April 11th, John Sharp, Sue's 15-year-old son, returned home with his friend, 17-year-old Dana Wingate. They'd been in Quincy, the nearby town, hanging out and trying to hitch a ride home. By all accounts, they made it back to Cabin 28 before 10 p.m. Inside the house were Sue, her youngest sons Rick and Greg, and their friend Justin Smart, who was spending the night. Tina, the 12-year-old daughter, had reportedly been at home earlier, but left to watch television at a nearby cabin before returning later. No one in that cabin would be the same after that night. Some wouldn't even live to see the next morning. At around 7 a.m. the next day, Sheila Sharp, Sue's teenage daughter who had spent the night at a neighbor's cabin, returned home. What she found inside Cabin 28 defied belief. The living room was drenched in blood. Her brother John lay on the floor, his throat slashed so deeply it nearly decapitated him. Beside him was his friend Dana, his head bashed in so severely that bone and brain matter were visible. Nearby lay Sue, bound and gagged with medical tape and electrical wire. She had been stabbed repeatedly, her body so mutilated it barely resembled a human form. A makeshift gag had been shoved in her mouth. Her underwear had been removed. Her body was partially nude. The scene suggested an intense, targeted rage, far beyond a random act of violence. And then, the fourth horror, Tina was gone. Her absence was so total, so bizarre, that for a time it wasn't clear whether she had been kidnapped or simply vanished in the chaos. Her disappearance added a new layer to the horror, one that would drag on for years. But here's where things start to twist. Inside the bedroom, sleeping in the same house where 3 people had just been brutally slaughtered, were Rick, Greg, and Justin. All 3 boys were unharmed. Not only were they alive, they hadn't even awoken during the murders. Or so it seemed. Some would later question whether Justin really slept through the night. His recounting of that night changed over time, and under hypnosis, he described seeing men in the house. Men with black glasses. One of them had a mustache. Another was wearing army boots. He spoke of a struggle, a knife, and Tina being led out the back door. Was it real memory? A dream? Or something planted by fear? The police response, from the very beginning, was botched. The crime scene was never properly secured. Neighbors were allowed to enter the cabin, contaminating potential evidence. Fingerprints and DNA were either not collected or not tested. Worse yet, early suspects were allowed to slip through the cracks. One of those suspects was Martin Smart, Justin's father. Martin had been in Cabin 26, just next door. He and his roommate, Bo Boubede, a former convict with connections to organized crime, had reportedly been drinking at the bar that night and were home around the time the murders took place. Martin later told investigators that he hated Sue Sharp. He believed she was interfering in his marriage and manipulating his son. When Martin was interviewed by police, he made several chilling statements. One stood out: "I've paid the price for what I've done." But what, exactly, had he done? His therapist would later report to the police that Martin had confessed to the murders during a session. Even more shocking, that confession wasn't followed up on. The file was lost, or perhaps deliberately buried. Years passed, and Tina Sharp remained missing. Then, in 1984, a discovery was made that shocked everyone. In a remote part of Plumas County, nearly 100 miles from Keddie, a bottle collector stumbled across a section of human skull and jawbone. Alongside it were fragments of clothing, a blouse, a pair of jeans, and a blanket. The remains were identified as Tina's. Now it was official. She hadn't just been taken. She had been killed and dumped in the woods like garbage. But why? Why remove only one victim from the cabin and dispose of her body separately? Some theories suggest she was the primary target. Others believe she witnessed the murders and was taken to silence her. There are whispers of a cover-up, a conspiracy involving local law enforcement, a murder so messy that it couldn't be pinned on one person without revealing the failures or corruption of the entire investigation. One piece of evidence remains particularly haunting. In the days following the murder, an anonymous call was placed to the police. "I think the remains found up on Feather Falls are those of Tina Sharp." At that time, the bones hadn't even been publicly identified. How did this caller know? The identity of the person on the other end of that call has never been discovered. The Keddie murders remain a stain on the history of justice. A brutal, unsolved crime that should have been solved decades ago. A mystery that refuses to die. And somewhere out there, someone knows the truth.